Hello everyone, and welcome to this seminar on the challenges of seaside towns. I had a lovely set of notes to do all my introductions and everything, but I seem to be having some major problems pulling them up. I'm just going to do the housekeeping rules first. You'll be kept on mute with your video off throughout. Please use the question and answer function to ask you questions about the presentations. It's really good if you can do this as the presentations go on, because it prompts others to think about questions as it comes up. This will be monitored, and then at the end I'll bring them all together and we'll discuss the presentations. There's also a chat function available to facilitate the discussion amongst yourselves, and we encourage you to share Twitter handles and the likes to allow other people to see what's going on in the event. Okay. Oh, brilliant. Here comes my notes. This is what I wanted. So hello and welcome to this second webinar in the series organised by the University of Plymouth on how we address the challenges faced by Britain's coastal communities. Before I give you an overview of what's been contained in the session, I've done all the housekeeping rules, so as you know, your microphones and cameras will be off, and add anything you want to the question and answer session. We're going to hear from each speaker in turn, and they're going to talk for about 25 minutes each. And then I'll do my best to bring all your questions together at the end to do a 30-minute question and discussion session. I suppose I should introduce myself first, sorry. My name is Christina Beatty. I'm Professor at the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research at CRESR for short, at Sheffield Hallam University. And although I probably live in the most landlocked part of Britain, I've been involved in a programme of research over the last 20 years, assessing various aspects of the long-term social and economic and labour market dynamics of Britain's seaside towns. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations in today's session, which is focusing on unlocking the economic potential of seaside towns in Britain and the opportunities and barriers that they face. It really couldn't seem to be more timely, given that we've heard nothing else but about levelling up in the last few weeks. So hopefully this will give us some ideas in and around a policy agenda that, in all honesty, doesn't seem to at times really tell us whether they're really going to focus and tailor things for specific places, or are they going to be targeting things at people. So first up, we have Lord Bassam of Brighton, whose talk is titled Choices, Challenges and Opportunities, Our Common Coastal Heritage. Steve is the former leader of Brighton and Hove Council and a former minister for previous Labour governments. He chaired the Lords Select Committee on the Future of Seaside Towns, and he's a shadow spokesperson for the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and indeed shadow spokesperson for the Department for International Trade. In his talk, he's going to outline some of the challenges that are facing coastal communities and examine ways in which some of our most remote parts of our coastline can be adapting to the threat of climate change and provide vibrant places for people to live and visit. After Lord Bassam, we have Professor Sheila Agarwal, whose talk is going to be focusing on economic challenges, barriers and opportunities in Britain's seaside towns. Sheila's the Associate Head of Plymouth Business School for Research and Innovation at the University of Plymouth, and she's been undertaking research on seaside towns for many years. In today's presentation, she's going to talk about the social and economic characteristics associated with leading and lagging English seaside towns, and she's going to highlight the complexity of both people and place-based factors and how they influence these areas' economic performance. Sheila's also going to talk about the need for evidence-based and tailored and targeted interventions if we are going to do something about the uneven growth across these areas. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Steve. So Steve, if you'd like to put on your camera and audio, and then you can fire away with your talk.
Thanks very much indeed, Tina. So back in April 2018, I was invited to chair a Lords Select Committee on the future of seaside towns. The Select Committee sat for a year and produced a well-received report examining the future prospects for our seaside communities. Published in April 2019, we concluded that a number of interventions were required if coastal communities were to keep pace with the economically more prosperous cities and metropolitan heartlands of England. In this session, I thought I'd outline some of the challenges facing seaside and coastal communities. I thought also I should examine ways in which the revival of some of the nation's most remote places could play a part in meeting the threat of climate change, provide enriched living for future generations and places of pleasure for visitors. So take this as a sort of COVID pandemic update, which looks to the future. Let's first start with a summary of what we found and what we recommended. The inquiry was very much evidence-led. After the publication of our call for evidence, we had 121 submissions of written evidence. We heard from 51 witnesses in 21 oral evidence sessions and undertook 6 major visits to a wide range of seaside towns, large and small. We had specialist sessions with local councillors, residents, service providers, school children, seaside experts, and we had a session with the local government associations, coastal communities, special interest group. Included amongst the witnesses were business leaders from the hospitality sector, the Environment Agency, architects, campaign groups, heritage experts, economists, leaders from local government, and also government ministerial advisors and the relevant local government minister. So it was a fairly eclectic cast list. We concluded that the 10% of the population that live and work by the seaside like being there, that they love the lifestyle and the beauty of the places and communities they choose. We also observed that on the whole, Brits still have an affection for the English seaside, which runs deep. They haven't so much fallen out of love with its salty nature or its seasonal charms, as decided to pay it less attention, unless, of course, the country is in the middle of a heat wave. So far as the British seaside is concerned, it has had to compete with more exotic overseas destinations, as travel, particularly in Europe, has become cheaper, easier and quicker. In the 60s, 70s and 80s, as incomes rose and horizons shrunk, the 2 weeks by the sea that for many was the limit of vacation and holiday ambition disappeared. The UK seaside, though still a popular place, became the focus for long weekends and day trips. The demise of traditional industries and factory working accelerated the decline. There was a sort of symbiotic ending, you might say, of the link between coast and city. The Select Committee report, however, was about more than just chronicling decline. We were tasked with looking at ways in which the seaside economies and communities were faring and coping, and what could be done to repurpose and find a way for them to find a new, unique selling point. We looked for success stories and for reinvention as much as we looked at the challenges of the changing economy and changed leisure patterns. The fact is, however, you can generate a successful destination economy that sits alongside deep and entrenched poverty and inequality. Blackpool probably is one of the clearest examples. Year on year, it tops the seaside destination leaderboard, 19 million visitor nights in the last pre-COVID year, but has within it 8 of the most deprived wards in the UK. So what did we find? Well, a seaside legacy and heritage too long neglected and resting on its Victorian and Edwardian roots. We found a failure to celebrate its attractiveness and environmental strengths. We thought there was an absence of a plan to manage the transition for communities historically reliant on fishing, shipbuilding, ports and tourism. We thought that the extensive peripherality, both geographic and economic, needed strong remedial intervention. We noted that seaside towns were evolving differentially, making it plain there could not be a one-size-fits-all solution, and that seaside towns need to regain their pioneering spirit with a long-term place-based vision driven by effective civic leadership. We thought there was an over-reliance on tourism and a need to diversify local economies, that there was poor connectivity in both transport and digital infrastructure, which held back regeneration. We found very poor housing stock, often coupled with benefit systems that created perverse incentives for landlords. We noted that there were transient populations also linked to seaside communities with both poor physical and mental health and relying on services that weren't fit for purpose. We found high numbers of severely disadvantaged young people, often with low aspirations, and leavers not returning, leading to lower levels of social mobility. We found poor access to both higher education and further education, often leading to a big skills mismatch, and a decline in the presence of the professions and professional services. We thought there were poor collaborative arrangements, which severely disabled economic development, and that there was a lack of community and business leadership, leading often to very short-term approaches and decisions. And we thought and concluded that there was a greater need for the local economic partnerships, the LEPs, to have a clarity of role and responsibility to work up stronger local visions and an industrial strategy. And finally, we found that there was a need for a long-term focus on problem solving from government, metro mayors, and from local authorities. So in the 2.5 years since we reported, you could almost say that everything and nothing has changed. We had a change of Conservative government and a new Prime Minister with a big mandate and a commitment to levelling up. And the world has, of course, experienced the longest pandemic since the Spanish flu of 1918 and the consequential financial aftershock of frozen economies closing and then opening. And we've had other things in the background, the uprising of Black Lives Matter and the quickening multiple impacts of climate change. Some of the challenges and issues that the report focused on have been exacerbated by the external context. Some, of course, have presented themselves as an opportunity, certainly in the short term, others as an existential threat. Of course, the combination of COVID and Brexit is changing the context in which our seaside economies and coastal communities continue to operate and evolve. On the plus side, government has at least begun to address some of the investment needs, and the Lord's report and other earlier reports examined the need for this. So when he became Prime Minister, Boris Johnson quickly seized on one of our proposals, the expansion of the Town Deal programme. Prior to July 2019, there was just one town deal in Grimsby. Our report urged the government to extend this experiment to Blackpool and beyond. But little did we imagine that the new Prime Minister was so impressed by our report that one would become 101. Now, how they were chosen remains something of a mystery, except they do seem to have a somewhat cosy fit with the new political geography of the UK. Many of the towns chosen would be on anyone's list of communities needing additional support. Places like Blackpool, Rochdale, Shipley, Keighley, Blythe, Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, Oldham and Workington. But Bournemouth, Newark, St Ives, Milton Keynes, Truro, I'm not so sure. All communities have needs, but generally governments have taken the view that proper criteria should be used for measuring social deprivation and economic deprivation rather than the crude electoral and political test. What is welcome is the additional resource, finding its way to our coastal communities and supplementing the Coastal Communities Fund, which was set up in 2012. Now, the town deals are essentially small and medium scale infrastructure programs, often based around schemes that mainstream local government historically would have picked up as a capital spend. Libraries, museums, art galleries, theatres, green transport, community hubs, sports centres, even new court buildings and skate parks. All of these are good things. Ideally, councils should fund these, and of course, historically, as I said, they have. Now they only get funding if in a centrally approved programme and supported by the local MP and much publicised as such. This, one might argue, is central government working by command and control of the sort that state bureaucracies of the old Eastern Bloc variety would have much admired. Now, I don't wish to appear entirely curmudgeonly, so I think the best put it on record that the money is welcome, even if I'm not certain that it's much to do at the moment with a coherent levelling up agenda, or local economic grievances, or poverty, or long-term social inequality. I suspect that rather like higher wages being used as a justification for Brexit, those arguments will come along to underpin the thinking behind spending programmes. I suppose, in fairness to government, it has yet to set out the policy drivers colouring in what it means by levelling up, which arguably should then inform the distribution of levelling up and the UK shared prosperity funds that follow on. The Levelling Up white paper is, as we know now, long overdue, But with Michael Gove at the helm of a department now given that title, I suspect it won't be long coming. The big question for those interested in the seaside and coastal communities and regeneration is whether the special needs they exhibit will be recognised. Logically, the levelling up vision would have come first, and the funding programmes, as I said, would be put in place to follow. But government, particularly this government, doesn't seem to work that way. The problems we identified back in 2019 have not gone away. Arguably, they've been amplified. COVID has much changed the landscape, in some places quite dramatically. Health inequalities have become far more apparent. Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, in his recent State of the Nation annual report, focused on just how big a disadvantage seaside communities are experiencing. He recently said that coastal towns have been overlooked by governments and had their ill health hidden. He rightly, in my view, said that Blackpool, Skegness and Hastings have more in common with each other than their neighbouring inland towns and cities. Echoing comments we made in our report about the coast, Professor Whitty said, coastal areas are some of the most beautiful, vibrant and historic in the country. They also have the worst health outcomes with low life expectancy and high rates of the many major diseases. He goes on to argue in the report that coastal towns need their own dedicated health improvement policy. As for health, so I would add, for education, transport skills training, cultural services, mental health services and housing, all these policy areas are interlinked. Professor Whitty draws attention to the causal connections, in particular between housing and ill health, rather as we did. The challenge for the future of our seaside heritage is profound. For the most part, coastal communities pay host to ageing populations with a steadily declining work-focused demographic. This places a strain on providers of care services and the NHS. Coupled with the flight of the middle-class professions, it means that the stretches and strains evident in the care sector during the pandemic are likely to become exacerbated as recruitment becomes ever more critical. Sheila Agarwal's work on the leaders and laggers amongst the seaside community usefully focuses on the relative economic performance of these communities and the key determinants that drive success and failure. For my part, they tend to reinforce what we found. Economically successful coastal towns and cities typically have a younger population. They will pay host to higher education institutions, will contain more graduates, will be well connected to the nation's rail and motorway networks, have access to a fast or superfast digital network, and will be strong cultural centres and contain a significant employer in the finance sector. I might throw in, just for good measure, that they also have a successful Premiership standard football club. Now, all of these elements, of course, imply other advantages, in particular, a robust and engaged middle class providing critical professional services in health, the law, finance and medicine. The truth is, of course, that not every seaside community can have the mix of elements that makes for a successful and resilient town, city or village. But if we believe as a good society in fairness and equality of access to the benefits of a successful economy, then it cannot be right simply to leave remote and peripheral communities to market forces and the politics of who shouts loudest wins. Moreover, it is economically illiterate and makes little sense to simply write off the skills and talents of populations that are being ignored or undervalued. Two shocking and worrying pieces of data were given to the Lord's inquiry about the two-speed nature of our society. The first was that studies showed that it was seaside communities that were experiencing the lowest levels of social mobility. Weymouth was the lowest in the UK. The second and linked piece of data was that in the period between 2012 and 2017, the number of students moving from sixth form and FE institutions to higher education from coastal communities had declined by 27%. That's a rapid change. And with COVID impacting on educational opportunities, I have little doubt that that picture will have only worsened. So to ask the eternal Leninist question, what is to be done? We can't replicate success everywhere based on a model that works for the Brightons and Bournemouths of the UK economy, but equally we cannot let places like Blackpool, Fleetwood, Penzance, Skegness, Clacton, Newhaven and Margate slip further back into the spiral of decline. Change is possible. And some of the lessons of Brighton and Bournemouth as upcoming towns and cities can be learned. But it is all about choices and challenges and making the most of the opportunities. So what are the big learnings? Well, firstly, interventions to be successful have to be for the long term, and they need to be driven by a vision. Secondly, the vision has to have leadership and key institutional drivers. Someone or something has to own that vision. Thirdly, collective imagination is required to make the best use of investable funding. Fourthly, partnerships involving public and private sector players are essential and have to be long-term and flexible. It also helps to get public buy-in to the vision so that host populations can see the benefit and own the outcome. Now, I can only speak with confidence of places I know. Back in the 1970s and 80s, Brighton and its sister town Hove were both struggling with high unemployment, declining public services, low educational attainment levels, poor levels of private investment, and the continued decline of their old engineering and manufacturing base. The railway, once a big employer with its locomotive works, closed, and rail services to London were poor and reliant on very old rolling stock. Brighton and Hove were both quaintly declining towns. Brighton was once memorably described by the writer Keith Waterhouse as a town that looked like it was helping the police with their inquiries, and it certainly felt that way. But in the 90s, Brighton and Hove began to change. The towns acquired a second university, decisions were taken to create an academic corridor along the main arterial Lewis Road. We invested in a two-stage plan to develop an innovation centre on the university campus at Sussex, and both universities invested with the local authority in the project. Wired Sussex was created, and as the Blair government came to power, the city bid for a medical school, again to be jointly run by the health service and the two universities. Additional funding was sought for the centre of Brighton to develop its cultural quarter and upgrade the dome complex and build a central library. There was also a seafront development plan. And plans were also passed to provide for a new state-of-the-art community football stadium at Falmouth. These projects have, each in their different and interlocked ways, become transformative. The two universities now provide places for in excess of 40,000 students, bringing immense, annually refreshed spending power into the city. The Innovation Centre has helped make the city a national digital hotspot with one of the highest business formation rates outside London. The arrival of the medical school has made Brighton and Hove a major centre for medical and health professionals and a strong regional health leader. The city has also become increasingly diverse and younger. The consolidation of Amex's services and the development of the football club since the stadium's construction has added to the sense of the city becoming a success story and transformed. Arts investment has grown, and with it, the Brighton Festival. The economy of Brighton and Hove is unrecognisable from where it was 50 or even 25 years ago. Now, plenty of other seaside and coastal towns have embarked on educational and culture-led recovery. Dundee, Margate, Falmouth, Scarborough, and even Blackpool, all with varying degrees of success. Looking at public policy, what does become clear is that for the magic formula to work, an integrated approach is needed. On their own, none of the towns and cities listed, and many more, can succeed. We need a more imagined and inventive approach. In an odd way, COVID, climate change, Brexit, and the social uprising of Black Lives Matter point the way. They speak to me about interdependency and mutuality. COVID cries out for a reasoned international response and cooperation, as of course, and obviously, does climate change. And surely the emerging challenges of the Brexit aftershock does to our economy. Black Lives Matter and the movement that's grown behind it, with its call for fairness and racial equality and an end to endemic racism, are part of the equation. Throw in the urgent pressures of climate change, and there is, of course, a perfect storm for the coastal towns to deal with. So how do they all sit with new policies that we urgently need to level up and spread the benefits of the new economy more fairly and equitably? How do we ensure that communities don't continue to feel disenfranchised, left out and left behind? Well, I don't have a manifesto or a list of prescriptive measures, but I do have some thoughts. Peripherality and living on the edge is a state of mind. It can be a feeling we all experience wherever we live. It can be felt in Weymouth and Clacton or Rochdale or Shipley, all places where low aspiration and opportunity have taken root. None of these towns are far from places where success is endemic and felt as a lived experience. All of them feel disconnected and left behind and look enviously at the major cities and city regions as they forge ahead in the UK's two-speed economy. So the challenge surely must be to make better use of the prosperous cities and emerging city regions to spread opportunity and get those strong players to foster and forge educational, industrial, business and civic links, spread their wealth and dynamism to include our forgotten towns and seaside communities. That way, we can unlock latent talent and hidden potential. We can learn the upside benefits from COVID brought by the increased use of interactive technologies like Zoom and Teams. We can decentralize arts and cultural services, take higher education out of previously rigid settings and set its benefits. So if Nottingham University can have a base in China and Coventry can put engineering in Scarborough, why not also use digital connectivity to decentralize employment and professional services? Put the back bedroom businesses based in North London on a par with those from North Lincoln. Let us use our experience of breaking down barriers in the knowledge economy to break down some of the feelings of disconnection which have left both our seaside heritage and old industrial small towns to which they were historically linked back into the national story. Improving local infrastructure using the town deals, levelling up and UK shared prosperity funds is fine. But these programmes are based on lengthy bidding rounds and will, I think, have a limited impact on long-term structural inequalities. To affect long-term change, they will need to be linked to social and educational change programmes of the what works variety. The old programme of Sure Start centres, early intervention education and health prevention measures, many of which have been abandoned over the last 11 years, might make a good starting point, but they need to be part of a national plan, a plan that involves an industrial strategy, civic engagement, and the drive of devolved organisations and local economic partnerships. They also need to be integrated into climate change remediation and net zero strategies. For seaside and coastal communities, these present an opportunity and a challenge. Coastal protection measures and renewal, as we discovered during our inquiry, offer the option of investment that can work to enhance seafront and coastal attractiveness as part of a regeneration strategy. We also discovered that there was a renewed urgency in some parts of the UK because of the threats that flooding posed to housing and the agri-economy of parts of Lincolnshire and also Kent. Lincolnshire alone produces roughly a third of UK market garden produce. So breaches of sea defence caused by extreme weather and rising sea levels could have a highly significant, not to say disastrous, impact on our economic future and ability to have a more self-sustaining food chain. Combined with the development of carbon neutral energy production, primarily solar and wind, in coastal areas, there is scope for the emergence of new, highly skilled local economies. The need will be for investment in the skills developed and acquired through FE and HE institutions. Some parts of the UK are already beginning to make this transformation and seeing change as a result. The Fylde Coast, parts of East Anglia and the Southwest, all areas of the UK where there are major issues linked to educational underperformance and low numbers of graduates and skills shortages, but where there are opportunities to grow and develop as the balance of the UK economy has to change. The challenge is obvious, but the potential far greater. So it could be argued that with the right kind of channeled investment, the seaside communities could be part of a new and more sustainable economic model, and one not just reliant on tourism, hospitality and heritage, a model that could contribute to a more sustainable future for all, combined with those earthly pleasures and pursuits much admired by Keith Waterhouse. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. That's a really good overview of the long-term and short-term issues facing our seaside towns. If you'd like to switch off your screen and audio now, and Sheila, if you'd like to come in and share your screen with your presentation, and then we'll return to the questions afterwards. Everyone, if you can add to the questions box as we go along, it's great because it really gets people thinking about things as we go along. All right then, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina. As Tina mentioned, my name is Professor Sheila Agarwal, and I am Associate Head for Research and Innovation at Plymouth Business School. Also, I recently became a co-director of our newly launched Centre for Coastal Communities, which I co-direct with my colleague, Professor Sheila, who's also the Director of the Plymouth Institute for Health and Care. I have a very long-standing interest in coastal communities, and particularly seaside resorts and seaside towns, one that extends, like Tina, over 20 years. And I have undertaken many studies spanning their social and economic ecologies, notably focusing on deprivation, social exclusion, the economic linkages, economic performance, regeneration, and in migration more recently. For the next 25 minutes or so, I wanted to outline some of the economic challenges facing English seaside towns, and in particular focus on some of the barriers and the opportunities that may help to unlock their economic potential. Some of which I'm drawing on today relates to a very recent study that I've undertaken with colleagues from the university and from the University of Hertfordshire that examined the underlying drivers of economic performance. It was a study that I also discussed with Professor Chris Whitty that informed some of the conclusions that he arrived at in his recent report on coastal health. In terms of discussing the economic challenges facing seaside towns, I'd like to start off very quickly by discussing what we know. Steve has already gone into quite a lot of detail around the conclusions and the findings of the House of Lords Select Committee, so I'm not going to dwell on these too long. But just to start off by saying, for seaside towns at least, as opposed to coastal communities, but for seaside towns at least, there is a reasonably comprehensive body of research which actually documents the economic challenges facing these localities. We know that we are witnessing multitude of challenges as new and worrying patterns of deprivation have materialised in some of the peripheral coastal areas across the UK. With respect to specific economic challenges, we know that many exhibit high employment, low rates of the economically active, notably pensioner and single parent households, low incomes, and the seasonality of the visitor economy. There have also been a host of studies which have documented the devastating impact of COVID-19 on some seaside towns. For example, research undertaken by the Social Market Foundation in 2019 demonstrated that the economic gap between coastal and non-coastal communities was found to have widened, with workers in seaside towns now earning almost £5,000 less than those elsewhere in the UK. But it's also important to emphasise that the problems experienced by many are not solely economic, and there are interlinkages, very close interlinkages, with health, with education, with housing, with deprivation, for example. And again, this was a particular point that was discussed at length with Professor Chris Whitty in the lead up to the production of his Coastal Health Report. And again, it was acknowledged in his concluding statements within that particular report. Many coastal communities are highlighted by low skills and education attainment, by social mobility, high rates of in and out migration, high rates of antidepressant and opioid prescribing, and poor public health outcomes. For instance, poor mental health in coastal communities is a specific problem. Many such localities are also characterised by semi-redundant tourist accommodation. This situation has been compounded through the development of low-cost housing and conversion of housing stock into multiple occupancy dwellings to house vulnerable people such as children in care and ex-offenders. Taken together, this has created transient and unstable communities and has placed considerable strain on local services, particularly social care. As we know, the recognition of these challenges are, of course, not new. In 2007, the House of Commons Communities and Local Government Committee called seaside towns one of the least understood of Britain's problem areas. These challenges were further reinforced, as we've heard already this afternoon, by the landmark House of Lords Select Committee inquiry on regenerating seaside towns, the focus of which, again, we've heard today. Recent policy papers, government policy papers, notably the Industrial Strategy White Paper published in 2017, Build Back Better and Levelling Up, also recognised an additional but very interrelated economic challenge of seaside towns, this being the existence of a productivity gap between coastal and non-coastal communities. Of course, Britain is not unique to that. Economic and productivity are among one of the persistent problems facing the tourism sector globally, with ongoing concerns around performance and competitiveness highlighted by organisations such as the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. So productivity isn't unique to the UK. Taking all of these challenges together, why haven't they been addressed before? Why have they persisted if we have known about them for over a decade? From my perspective, there are a multitude of reasons to explain why. First of all, there is a lack of systematic investigation into the nature and into the diversity of seaside towns. While many are visibly lagging, high levels of deprivation, dying town centres, high crime, others are in fact doing very well indeed. They are leading. And I've given some examples on these particular visuals below. So localities, for example, such as Bournemouth and Brighton, they do contain deprived neighbourhoods, yes, but they do have very diverse economies, and they do benefit from the location of universities, conference centres. They have great transport links, good public amenities, as well as investment in high-tech digital sector and the knowledge economy. Other localities, again, like Brighton, thrives because of its vibrant arts and music scene, and also it has a very culture-led creative industries approach to energy regeneration, and I'll come back to that in a little while. And then other towns, Whitby, St Ives, for example, enjoy reputations as gastronomic destinations. And there's growing interest in water-based leisure amenities, in supporting economic regeneration, again in towns such as St Ives, Bude, Newquay, Exmouth. Another reason why these challenges have persisted is that there really is a lack of evidence base, and there are a number of reasons for this, and I'll mention this in a number of occasions throughout my talk today. But what this has resulted in is that the specific needs of seaside towns are actually underreported. Administrative geographies, such as local authorities, clinical commissioning groups, integrated care systems, and even political constituencies, they all serve predominantly coastal populations. Most routine data is published at this level, and then often the specific needs of coastal towns are underreported. They're kind of conflated within the bigger picture. A third reason is that we lack a classification for coastal areas, but we also lack distinct linked data, linked granular data as well. Existing geodemographic segmentations don't generally distinguish between coastal and other areas. For example, the ONS output area classification only identifies 2 coastal subgroups. And in doing so, while they may show similarities between coastal and non-coastal areas, they actually hide the diversity of coastal circumstances. And even when there has been large-scale analyses that are specifically had a coastal focus, as in the case of the recent 2020 Office of National Statistics report, which collated data relating to 169 coastal towns, large sections of coastal residents were excluded. So in this particular case, those living in towns and cities with populations over 225,000, as well as those in rural districts, were excluded. And together, these groups constitute nearly half of the 10.4 million people living in coastal localities. In addition to these reasons, there are a number of barriers which are also preventing addressing the economic challenges that many seaside towns are facing. Whilst we know a lot about the types of economic challenges being faced, our evidence base is particularly poor, and our knowledge and understanding of the underlying drivers, the underlying causes, are piecemeal. And this is largely because of data difficulties, again, which I'll come back to in a minute. But it means that only a handful of studies have explored the socio-economic ecology of seaside towns, most of which have been undertaken by our chair, Tina, and her colleague, Steve Fothergill, and other colleagues as well. So in 2003, Tina and Steve focused on 43 of the largest seaside towns with populations over 10,000, followed by their study in 2009, which investigated 37 seaside towns with resident populations between 1,500 and 10,000, and then later their 2014 benchmarking study of 121 seaside towns across England and Wales. Knowledge is even more limited in thinking about the economic performance of these localities. In terms of what we know, the existing data, the existing evidence points to the fact that there are regional and there are interregional variations in economic performance. Size was also not an issue, but these studies pointed to the fact that location and accessibility, as we know, peripherality, are. Beatty and Fothergill found that poor economic performance as expressed by unemployment was not so much attributed to local economic factors, but rather to high immigration. And then a recent study that I've undertaken with colleagues at the University of Plymouth and Hertfordshire have unveiled some quite fascinating underlying drivers of economic performance. The particular study looked across 58 of England's largest seaside towns, and it initially focused on 17 people and place-based factors, which encompass facets of economic, human, and environmental capital. And it assessed their influence on 3 distinct components of economic performance: productivity, employment, and labour market participation. Their influence was ranked against economic performance, and it enabled the identification of 10 leading and 10 lagging seaside towns. So I'm sure you'll be interested to see which were the leaders and which are the laggers. So this particular table here summarises, actually identified more than 10. It identified in rank order of 1 to 58, but it's too much to show on a particular slide here. But in terms of the leading, and hopefully this wouldn't become as any big surprise to you all, Formby in the northwest coast, Christchurch, Hoylake, Whitstable, Swanage, West Kirby, Sidmouth, Clevedon, Southend-on-Sea, and then number 10, Southport. They were the leading seaside towns. And then in terms of the laggers, number 1 was sadly Skegness, followed by Clacton-on-Sea, Ramsgate, Penzance, Fleetwood, Heysham, Morecambe, New Brighton, Blackpool, and Margate. Following this initial analysis, we undertook an analysis of the means difference across a much wider range of people and place-based human, economic, and capital factors. It drew on a seaside town database which collated over 100 economic and social variables drawn from secondary data and across the 58 largest seaside towns. And we were able to distinguish characteristics most commonly associated with leading and lagging seaside towns. So in terms of the characteristics, I've done a very brief summary here. These were significant differences, these variables, between the leaders and the laggers. And again, there are not particularly surprising here in the fact that characteristics most commonly associated with leading seaside towns were those those towns exhibited higher employment, less people on welfare, more people employed in managerial and professional jobs, more people employed in finance, insurance, and banking. There were more people within the towns in good health. They enjoyed higher incomes. There was lower in and out migration rates, higher educational attainment and skills, higher car and van ownership, and what might be surprising to some, a greater proportion of the retired 65 plus years old were associated with leading seaside towns. In terms of the characteristics associated with the laggers, again, not unexpectedly, it almost mirrors the characteristics of leading, where lower employment, these towns exhibited more people on welfare and benefits. They had more people in unskilled and manual jobs, more single parent households, more people with long-term limiting life illnesses and disabilities living in these towns, lower incomes, much higher in and out migration, lower educational attainment and skills, lower car and van ownership, and more living in social, private, and rented housing. So in doing this study, I think it is the first to evidence empirically that place and people factors are intrinsically interlinked in determining the economic performance, the productivity of seaside towns. And therefore, it also points to the need to raise productivity in these lagging towns by undertaking a number of interventions. Because the problems are so interlinked between place and people, there is a need for dual people and place strategies and interventions, and these should be around creating more stable communities based on more employment, attracting more people in managerial and professional occupations, creating more digitally supported knowledge-based jobs that overcome distance to labour and product markets associated with peripherality, and providing more education, skills development and training. But it is this interconnectedness of people and place factors which also highlights the difficulty of actually affecting change. So, for example, there isn't any quick fix to rectify a lack of workforce skills, although increased provision of online and distance learning, further in higher education, or the creation of satellite campuses linked to existing higher education institutions may help to widen the opportunities available and increase engagement through flexible programmes that are studied alongside work. The effectiveness of such remedial measures is heavily dependent on the motivations and aspirations of the populations, particularly young people. Another barrier, of course, which was again discussed with Professor Whitty, and I wasn't alone in making this particular point, because he talked to many people in the production of his coastal health report, is linked to the lack of granular data, linked data in relation to seaside resorts and coastal communities more generally. Those who have attempted to research coastal towns or coastal communities know that undertaking studies is extremely problematic due to the lack of granular data that is available and which is linked across data providers such as the ONS, Public Health, Department for Education. And again, this was a problem that was acknowledged in the Chief Medical Officer's 2021 report. Now, whilst in itself the lack of data might appear to be an issue that primarily affects academic study, in the words of Professor Whitty in a recent lecture at Plymouth University, if we can't see the problem through data, how then can we understand it and address it? So there really is a need for this evidence base to materialise. So these are some of the challenges. I didn't want to end the presentation on a kind of a pessimistic, negative note. I wanted to end it really on a more positive note, because there are opportunities of unlocking the potential, the economic potential of seaside towns. And one of the opportunities, and I think there's no better time to seize it, and we have to seize it, is this increased policy attention on seaside towns and coastal communities. You know, I keep saying that the House of Lords, Lord Bassam was very humble, you know, in his summary of kind of what he felt it achieved, but I really do feel that it was a landmark inquiry, because it set in motion a number of policy developments, not least the formation of an all-party parliamentary group on coastal communities, chaired by our esteemed Member of Parliament, Sally Ann Hart. This has also led to calls for a national strategy by this APPG, which again also features in Professor Whitty's report, and additional calls by the APPG for the formation of a coastal department within Whitehall to deal with the interlinked challenges facing our seaside towns. A key question around institutional capacity, institutional thickness. You know, there's lots of issues around cross-departmental cooperation. I won't dwell on those today. The other opportunity, which Steve's also mentioned, was increased funding as well. We all know that seaside towns have benefited, or some of them have benefited from the Coastal Communities Fund. But this funding has now been replaced by a host of other pots of money, such as the Welcome Back Fund, New Town Deals, Shared Prosperity Fund, and the Future High Street Fund. There are additional promises that seaside towns will benefit from funds as part of Build Back Better and levelling up agendas, but we shall wait and see on how that materialises. It isn't just the fact that there is increased funding and investment, but also it's been the hook on which to base many initiatives and partnerships that are going on in many different localities. And I do get a sense that there is increased partnership working now across the local authorities and all interested stakeholders. Partnerships for me have always traditionally been problematic in seaside towns due to the fragmentation of the industry, the interlinkage of the problems, and the existence of quite divided social and political communities. However, the availability of funding does appear to be acting as a hook to generate increased collaboration between the public and the private sectors. I was very privileged to chair a UK government's event conference on seaside and coastal town regeneration last Thursday, where I got to hear about some of these great many partnerships that are now operating across seaside towns and which are starting to look at a variety of different challenges. For example, Transport for the North, working with Atkins on a project, and separately East Lindsey District Council. Both of these are partnerships are working to improve connectivity to and with seaside towns. So in the case of East Lindsey District Council, they have a project around connected coasts where they're looking at connecting Skegness and Mablethorpe much better together. So they're addressing problems relating to peripherality. There are also problems addressing antisocial behaviours in seaside towns, such as Copeland Borough Council, which is responsible for Whitehaven, a town that has deprivation. And really, this is great practice in terms of this particular issue, addressing this issue. There are also great partnerships that are focused on placemaking, whether this is through the adoption of community-based assets, as in the case of Morecambe, or the design and implementation of cultural and regeneration, of cultural and creative industries regeneration strategies, as in the case of Brighton and Hove, which is seeking to extend the visitor season and addressing seasonality. So it was really fantastic to hear about the examples of best practices, experiences, ways of working that are potentially applicable to other seaside towns and coastal communities. And then finally, in terms of the opportunities, there are opportunities for greater integration with the blue economy. I hear many times about the fact that seaside towns have limited opportunities due to the nature of their location and the fact that they only have a 180-degree economy. And yet there are opportunities to look outwards towards the sea for some. The Blue New Deal, launched by the New Economics Foundation, is looking at this. Their mission is to put healthy seas at the heart of new economic plans, projects and businesses, connecting local efforts to change at scale and enabling policy change so it empowers rather than frustrates those who want to innovate and lead the reinvention of their coastal places. There's also opportunities for offshore renewable energy, and I know Grimsby particularly sees that mantle. There are the creation at the very top of the visual of national marine parks, and Plymouth have been very lucky to have created one. And then there are opportunities for sustainable aquaculture as well. So just to conclude, for me, there's never been a better time to address the economic challenges facing seaside towns and our coastal communities more specifically. As you've seen today, there are numerous barriers, but there are opportunities as well. There is much work to be done. At present, building back better and the levelling up agendas are largely rhetoric. And perhaps the most critical question of how we can address these challenges poses somewhat of a policy conundrum. Stemming from this are several questions that are concern for many seaside towns and coastal communities, such as how can levelling up in some of the most deprived seaside towns be achieved? Given the interlinked nature of the problems being experienced, so the problems such as housing, health, education, and what should the priorities of levelling up be? How can national government best support local authorities to regenerate their coastal towns? And what specific policy interventions, mechanisms and strategies should be designed to encourage local and economic growth? Clearly, policy development and the design of interventions, strategies and mechanisms does need to be accompanied by a very good understanding of the circumstances and the context. And we need to do something, and something quite quickly. You know, inequality impacts economic growth by widening the gap between the lower middle classes and the poor. Education opportunities for children from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds are undermined, lowering social mobility and hampering skills development. And these are all problems. It's a vicious circle, and these are all problems which are already prolific in lagging seaside towns. So thank you very much for your time and for listening to me.
Great, Sheila, that's really good. It shows you all of this interlinking nature of some of these problems in these particular areas. And I think links well with the stuff that Steve was already saying. Well, we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to start posing those to you. And they're aimed at both of you in a sense. There's the first one here is from Sheila Asana, who's interested in how specific investments, especially in and around area-based regeneration, can make up for the deficit in more mainstream funding. And she highlights the notable differences in educational spend per pupil, say that it's far higher in London compared to the periphery, even though we know that children's attainment levels in London have been outstripping other areas over time, especially in coastal areas. Transport funding, how it's very unevenly distributed, again, London benefiting to a great extent. NHS funding has been shifting towards more deprived and coastal areas, but this shift backwards is it notable that the failing hospitals that are often attributed to poor management are not randomly distributed, and they're more likely again to be found on the periphery. So to sum all of that up, the question is, do we have buy-in from the ministers across government departments to do something about these things? Which one of you wants to take that?
Well, I suppose I can start, can't I? Trouble is, I've got a sort of political axe to grind it in a way. I mean, it does look very odd that health outcomes are so skewed. And there's no doubt that there's a long history to declining health services, or perhaps put another way, health services falling behind in coastal areas. And I think that's why Chris Whitty alighted on the idea of trying to locate more medical schools on the coast. When I talked to him, rather like Sheila, he certainly was quite drawn to the idea of putting more educational institutions in peripheral areas, because you get the benefit, you get a double benefit. You get the benefit of the investment, and you get the benefit of it changing the local demographic, and then adding to and enriching the quality potentially of local services. And that certainly seems to have worked here. I think it probably works in Southampton, which is another large coastal based community. So you've got to make interventions of that sort. With education, I think there is a real challenge, because you've got to somehow incentivize young teachers going to coastal areas, because there's little doubt that the quality of teaching in a lot of the coastal communities is falling behind. I anecdotally, when we did our inquiry, we visited Clacton. Clacton, sadly, is an area I know very well. I went to school there. I went to a failing school there because I'd failed my 11 plus. And the thing that was very interesting and evident was that the kids at the high school were still saying what had been said to me growing up, years before. And that was, as soon as we leave Clacton, we're not coming back. And I then asked them and the teachers where they came from. And the teachers said, well, I live in ... and it would be a nice, tasty area, probably 20 miles away from Clacton on Sea, often in Colchester, which was more interesting and more exciting. And so the teaching profession, no longer had that link with the local community it was serving. And that's actually terribly important in education. And it was certainly present back in the 60s. So the quality of the teachers was probably higher, and also they were more driven. That's just one intervention you've got to think about, how you incentivize getting good quality teachers back into those communities. The other issue we picked up in regard to education was that FE as a sector was struggling, and it was struggling because the pupils were finding it hard in a lot of the remote areas to get access. They were having to travel long distances, and they were finding that their teaching face-to-face time was shorter, and the courses on offer weren't so interesting. So we've got to look again at FE and what FE is doing. Look again at the way in which apprenticeships are offered. Look again at how you can migrate from FE to HE. So there's quite a lot there. There's quite a big agenda, I think, and we've got to put those things forward, because otherwise, the levelling up stuff will not amount to a hill of beans, because the social interventions will go missing.
Okay, I just taking sort of a different perspective in terms of Sheena's questions about the enormity, about whether ministers, do they have the buying? I think it's less a question of whether there's a buying and more of a question of the understanding about the enormity of the challenge. Because we quite blandly say education, health, housing, but within that is a whole subset of equally really big problems that that need to be addressed. And because it cuts across, these problems cut across so many different areas and different departments, and I think my biggest fear is that we don't have the institutional capacity to be able to address them in a coherent manner. We know that within government there's interdepartmental rivalry, and it's that institutional capacity that we need to engender, so that there is a collective, a coordinated buying from all ministers across all different areas to actually address coastal communities.
Indeed, I think as well, what time shows over time is how it doesn't change. Having worked on the New Deal for Communities evaluation for 10 years about the whole importance of holistic regeneration in areas if you're going to try and tackle some of these interrelated issues, and the need for joined up working across departments and policy areas. But no matter which government is in, we don't really seem to actually break that cycle. So I think there's important lessons there for policymakers. The next question is from Tupana Bagchi. She says, thanks for your presentation. She really enjoyed them. She's doing lots of research in around multiculturalism, predominantly in very white Plymouth. And she's, saying about the lack of literature that there is in and around these issues about ethnic minority populations, particularly in coastal communities. Thankfully, she has read some of our stuff in and around tourism and yours, Sheila, but says that there's hardly anything in and around the sort of education studies, and whether you have anything to say about throwing some light on the ethnic minority communities and conditions within any seaside towns in particular or overall. And indeed, if you could suggest any literature her way, she'll be more than welcome for it.
Steve, would you like to make a comment, or?
Sheila, you go first. You know more about the literature, I don't.
Okay, I have. We have chatted, Sapana, over email about this, and you're very correct. There is a distinct lack of literature around ethnic minorities and coastal communities per se. So I think, in terms of your research, you've identified a really good research gap there to follow up. I mean, the only thing that cropped up in relation to that came as a result of a study that I did with colleagues around deprived local neighbourhoods in seaside towns. And some of the most deprived neighbourhoods were associated with ethnic communities, and they were sort of very much located geographically along the seafront or near the seafront. But that's the only thing that I've actually come across in relation to that. I don't know whether you have, Tina.
I think the main thing we've found over time when we've tried to do sort of systematic data collection across seaside towns is the fact that because we're often looking at below local authority level and trying to understand the actual towns themselves, there's very little data that goes to a level that you can actually say anything reliable if it's based on survey stuff and everything. So it tends to be relatively limited. Sorry, that's my neighbours just cutting some paving slabs next door. So basically, I think that's part of the issue, that they do tend to have relatively small ethnic minority communities, and data-wise, it's very hard to pick up anything in and around it systematically. So indeed, it is a gap in the knowledge base. Census will be your next chance when the data starts getting released from that. It's always a great way to be able to see something about ethnic minority communities in small areas or specifically defined areas. So I think that's probably your next opportunity to really sort of get to grips with what might be going on in some of the areas.
One thought, I mean, I don't know enough about the literature, but I'm sure you're absolutely right about that. But the fact of the matter is that our coastal and seaside communities are very white. You know, there's no question that that's the case. Clacton, when I left Clacton in 1971, you know, I could almost point you at the shops that were run by Asian businesses, and there were probably 2 of them, and that was it. They sent their kids to the local secondary schools. And when I went back, you know, just a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the very, very small number of ethnic minority, very small ethnic minority population. I'd looked at the data, 98% white. I think maybe one fruitful source might be to look at health employment statistics. The health service does, because it's a professional-based service, essentially, it does mean that you get sort of more migration out of the metropolitan areas of Black and minority ethnic NHS employees, and I've certainly noticed a big change in Brighton with the health service developing, and also the medical school. And Brighton has a much more diverse population, whereas when I came here first in the early 70s, Brighton felt like Clacton-on-Sea, but that has changed. And it's also true, and I think this is an interesting point, that where you've got a better racial and class mix, you've got a more dynamic community, and no question about that, economically dynamic. And you know, if we can but tackle the sort of some of the endemic racism that is there in a lot of white seaside and coastal communities, then those communities will become not just economically healthier, but socially healthier as well, and you know, better places to be, frankly.
Thank you. I think the next question we've got in here is from Alex Gibson, which I think is actually a really, really good question and relates to all things when we're talking about maybe policies which are focused specifically on different types of areas in different economic and geographic contexts. So Alex says, is there anything really specific and unique that distinguishes seaside towns and coastal communities from their non-coastal equivalents? So given what Sheila's been saying, you know, is there merit in talking about coastal towns and communities in a single category, rather than there's different ones within that group? And it leaves him to wonder that given levelling up agenda, are there particularly policy interventions that are needed to address coastal challenges which are not equally as applicable to declining towns or cities elsewhere? And is focusing on coastal a distraction that is it all just about levelling up?
I don't think it's a distraction. I mean, I completely get the point. You know, there are similarities between, obviously similarities between, you know, coastal communities that are falling behind in sort of economic terms, social terms, facilities provision, etc., that are similar to those sort of red wall towns that went Tory in the last election. that feeling left out, left behind, decline, traditional industries going, not being replaced, etc. So that's a similarity. But then I think the benefit of focusing on seaside towns in terms of argument and sort of approaching public policy is that you do identify them as being places that need similar rethinking, reimagining, because that's what it's, levelling up's got to be about. Clearly, interventions in the past have had limited success. Some of them successful, certainly, and it can be done. But I think there is a good case to make. Whether I don't think we should have necessarily a separate seaside department, but I think because the strength the potential strength is to improve those communities by linking them into and getting them specially recognised as places that are fallen behind and deprived and need more infrastructure investment. So I think that they've got to, if you keep them in the mainstream, it's a good chance you can do it. It's just that in the prioritisation, they've definitely been left behind, and that's what we've got to address and focus on, and develop a logic which says that our communities are interdependent, rely on each other, and need to draw from each other's strengths rather than be separated out. And I think that way may well lie a more successful intervention in terms of getting new additional resources and new thinking. And of course, the one big issue that confronts all seaside communities by and large is they're off the beaten track. They don't have so very few of them have really good rail and road interconnections. There's not a single motorway that goes to a seaside town or city. They go close by, but very few are actually at them. They don't start there, they don't finish there. And most of the coastal communities, certainly the smaller ones, lost their access to the rail network. And it's absolutely bonkers that it takes 3.5 hours to get to Lowestoft, and you can get to Newcastle in that period of time. There's stupidities about our transport connectivity, which are really important to overcome.
Okay, I'd like to sort of have a go at answering this question. Thanks, Alex. I think you raise a really important issue and a challenge here. I think the key thing is, in terms of your thoughts around it, is focusing on the coast to distraction. We actually don't know. Again, I'm coming back to the sort of the lack of evidence base that there is due to the difficulty in researching these areas. We don't know if there's a coastal effect going on specifically. And I think that is the key issue. While we have a rural and urban classification, and it does make it more easier to see the dynamics of what's going on within those areas, we don't have a coastal classification. And this is what we are working on producing at Plymouth. At the moment, we're working on an application for funding, which is looking at producing a geodemographic coastal classification, one that recognises the diversity of the coastal communities that exist. So whether they're coastal towns, whether they're based on tourism, whether they're based on fisheries that are all ports, declining ports, whether they were based on the armed forces, the Navy, to look at commonalities, the similarities across them, and then that would help them produce tailored interventions. So from my perspective, I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's something that is really important to find out if there is actually a coastal effect. So we can talk, instead of just about rural and urban areas, we can talk about coastal, rural and urban areas.
And Alex, yeah, I think there is an issue. And I think consistently over time, when you map certain things in and around across the whole country, what you do see is time and time again, your hotspots for unemployment, large numbers of people on incapacity benefits, issues in and around the weakness of the labour markets and how that interacts, issues in and around housing. Over the last 30 years that I've been a CRESR, almost every map I do, as well as all the research we do looking at older industrial towns and former coalfields and those types of areas, which have very similar things that will come up as a concentration of deprivation or issues in those areas. The seaside towns keep coming through. And I think maybe that what's sort of picking up on that thing that Sheila's saying in and around the need for a tailored set of interventions. So maybe some of the underlying characteristics aren't that different, but actually some of the solutions on how you might deal with them or the opportunities that might be there for how you deal with them could be quite a different answer, say in a former coalfield in the Welsh Valleys than it would be in a seaside town and in certain areas. And I think the other thing that really needs to be picked up in and around seaside towns is they are not all the same. So it's trying to understand that diversity between different types, subcategories of seaside towns, because the larger cities, you know, the likes of Brighton and Bournemouth are very different than some of the smaller ones or some of the ones up on the northeast coast, or depending where they're, which wider region they're within, and all of those other issues in and around transport, health, housing, labour markets and the works. So I would say they do need a specific set of policies, and I think maybe that's where at times the levelling up agenda just really isn't quite getting it, that it's not just about a one size fits all. And you need, you know, a former coalfield might need a different set of strategies than a set of seaside towns. And those seaside towns might be a different set of strategies if they're up on the Lincolnshire coast compared to if they're in the southwest or Cornwall. So I think that having place-based interventions is a good thing, and it makes you think about the solutions of what you might be able to do, which might be a different package of interventions than actually the fact that they all do have some underlying similarity in some of the natures of the problems that they've got in those areas. Although I shouldn't say problems, challenges that some of these areas have. We've got another question as well. Hang on, I just need to move my screen. I won't be a sec. This one is from Robert Brown. And again says, thank you very much for your talks. He says various psychological research links they reveal strong links between people's job-related performance and what they do and their identity. Further, architectural and cultural geography research suggests that a link between identity of place and what people do in that place, and then the identity of people living in that place. There can be a negative corollary between the loss of employment that undermines an individual's or communal sense of identity, or the individual communal identification with that place. There is a need for further research here, but also a consideration of the regeneration strategies that might aim to join up the way that new sources of employment and enhance existing opportunities and new identities and promote stronger engagement with that place. So he's making a comment or an observation more than a question, but I suppose whether anybody wants to say anything about those links between identity of place and their reason for being, and how that might link in with what their opportunities for future employment growth or those types of things might be.
Identity is important, actually. You feel it when if you go to Cornwall. People talk about being Cornish. They don't talk about being East Sussex-ish or West Sussex-ish. But identity is really very important, and I think it can be something that coastal communities can trade on. Certainly, in sort of economic terms, and it brings a sort of sense of difference and pride. Those things are important to communities, particularly smaller ones, I think. Where does it fit in the sort of policy mix? I'm not sure, but I suppose it does help make the argument for extra resource for places that feel they've been missed out or left out, overlooked, etc.
I think it's really important in terms of placemaking, linking it into identity. You get ownership, you get self-confidence, you get pride within a community by linking very much placemaking and the identity of the place. And I think this is where you can have several really good lessons of good practice from somewhere like Brighton, which have a very progressive culture. And I mentioned this in my talk: culture, creative industries, creative tourism approach, very community orientated approach to regeneration. They do lots of stakeholder engagement with the community through online platforms and interviews and focus groups, so that they're devising a strategy that is representative of the population who live there, and it's enabled to showcase their voices, and that it's all about self-expression there, and I think that's really, really important. As an aside, an interesting sort of piece of work I'm looking to take forward at some point is around the representation of coastal towns, particularly those that have a former sort of heritage based on slavery, and how do you represent that, which is kind of built into the built fabric of these towns. How do you actually then take forward a new identity to project about that town? So no, really good question. Thank you, Bob.
I see, looking at our clock, we're in the last couple of minutes or so. There's a nice question here that hopefully I can give you a minute each on to try and wrap up the session. So Sheila asked an additional question about, it's great that the needs of seaside towns are being recognised, and do you think that there's a growing recognition amongst policymakers that there are other types of coastal community that need support, and that they vary considerably between them? And I think I'd just tack onto that, thinking about in a post-pandemic world, what opportunities that might mean for either the places or the policymakers in terms of remote working, housing, commute, or we might be entering a phase of change about where people live and work and those sorts of things. So if you could give yourself a minute each on something in and around policy direction and future.
Well, I think that COVID has underlined the value of remote working and interactive studying that can only benefit coastal communities. And I'd like to see more of it, and I think it would help, particularly help with the decentralizing of the economy. And I sort of made that point in my contribution, actually. So I'll leave it there to you.
Okay, Sheila, it's over to you for the last comment of the session.
Well, this is something that I discussed with Sally Ann Hart at the conference last week, and I think COVID has highlighted the need for the redistribution of visitors around our coastal destinations. Certainly in the southwest, there's been a lot of talk around over tourism, and some of the issues around the quality of life for local residents as well. So while COVID has revealed lots of opportunities as well, I think that it's also revealed some sort of quite critical management issues for destinations to address. I'll leave it there.
Well, that is spot on the nose. It's 2:30. So thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks to our speakers. I think we'd all give you a clap of hands if we could see the clap of hands around people who have taken part. And we all look forward to seeing the next seminar in the series. Okay, goodbye everyone.